we've talked in preview form about these things, but I stumbled upon an author that I really, really enjoyed named William Bill Federer. Years ago, I was doing a teaching series on Islam, and his book, What Everyone Needs to Know About the Quran, was one of the, I think, 18 sources I used for that teaching series. He is an astounding writer. I would argue one of the top Christian historians in the nation. You think people come to mind like Rodney Stark, David Barton. Definitely, William Federer is right there with him. I wanted to give you a little bit of his background. He's a nationally known speaker, best-selling author. He's authored over 20 books, some of which are on that back table. I don't own a bad William Federer book. I just don't. His website's entitled The American Minute. It broadcasts daily across America, and it's on the internet. His television background, he was a U.S. congressional candidate. Bill has appeared on C-SPAN, Fox, Hannity and Combs, O'Reilly Factor, NPR, MSNBC, ABC, nearly all the ABC Time Warner affiliates, CBN, TBN, INSP, TCT, FamilyNet, Familyland TV, Coral Ridge Hour, 700 Club, AT&T Cable, Charter Cable, The Danny Fontana Show, iLife TV, Fox. You get it. Are you understanding where we're coming from here? Again, Bill's American Minute's broadcast daily. His publications have been quoted or referenced in USA Today, Human Events, the New York Times, the Washington Times, the Washington Post, Roll Call. I was shocked. I heard Bill speak. I recognized his name, and I went to go hear him speak for Horatio Christie at FGCU a couple of weeks ago. Hello. There you go, Horatio Christie and Chi Alpha. Horatio Christie's one arm of campus ministry. The AG arm is Chi Alpha. And I heard him speak, and I was shocked to hear two things. One, that he lives in the area. It's like, whoa, right? Okay. And then second, that he was coming to our church and loved Pastor Betzer. I'm like, well, brother, we have a Sunday school class that would love to hear you. And just an incredible man of God, excellent character. Would you give it up for William Federer?
Thank you, Pastor Joe. Thank you. Well, thank you, Pastor Joe. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here. And my wife and I moved here a year and a half ago, and we've visited all kinds of churches. And every place I go around the country, they said, Pastor Dan Betzer, he's the absolute best. He's the absolute tremendous. And finally, my wife and I came, and we just fell in love with Pastor Betzer. And we've been going to the Saturday night service, but it is just so gifted. You are so blessed here. And the Lord has used this church and is impacting the entire world, as you heard from the missionary movement. So you are tremendously blessed, and it's a great, great honor for me to be here today. And thank you, Pastor Joe, for inviting me. Well, with that, I write books, and I go around and give talks. And so this is one of them that I thought you'd be interested in, and especially with this next week and all the elections and so forth. Now, feel free to dim the lights so you can see the screen a little bit clearer. I sort of have a presentation that makes more sense if you can see the pictures. And so I ran for Congress several times, and so I decided to see what's the most common form of government in world history. And so I went back to the beginning of the invention of writing. I wanted the big picture. So let's go back and see the beginning. So writing was invented around 3300 BC. Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. Today that's Iraq. And take a stick, poke it in clay. That's the beginning of writing. Here's Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist that has the Cosmos TV series. He says it was here around 5,000 years ago between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we learned how to write. And then Egyptian hieroglyphics were invented around 3000 BC. And Chinese pictogram characters were invented around 2600 BC, the Yellow Emperor on bamboo annal books. And India's earliest civilizations, 2600 BC, the Harappan. So you round it out, there's around 5,000 or 6,000 years of recorded human history, right? Human beings writing down human records. And so it's not that long, right? 3 or 4,000 years BC and around 2080. So that's around 5,000 or 6,000 years. And Franklin Roosevelt said, 5,000 years of recorded history have proven that mankind has always believed in God in spite of the many abortive attempts to exile God. So he uses the number of 5,000. And Richard Overy wrote the Times Complete History of the World. No date appears before the start of human civilizations around 5,500 years ago and the beginning of a written or pictorial history. 6,000 years is not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it? Maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. It's not that long ago. 60 people living 100 years each back to back. Well, now that we have 6,000 years of records, what do they show? They show that there's been a 6,000-year quest to rule the world. The most common form of government is a king. And so one of the very first records is Nimrod, Tower of Babel. And the Jewish commentator Josephus said Nimrod wanted to build the tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. So it sort of had a defiant, in-your-face attitude toward God. Some of the stories were that he made everybody in the city bake bricks, and if they didn't, he'd kill them, and so they had to bring the bricks. It was sort of a force type thing. And God comes down and confuses the languages, and what? The people scatter. So we see this first illustration of power concentrated, defiant against God, and power separated into the hands of the people. But it's almost like every generation since has tried to rebuild the Tower of Babel. Only on a bigger scale, because with military advancements, you can kill more people, right? Iron stronger than bronze, and the compound bow, and the phalanx spear, and the scimitar sword, and the gunpowder, and anyway. So, have you ever seen a nautilus seashell? And it does a little circle, a little bigger circle, a little bigger circle. That's actually a rate of geometric expansion called the golden ratio, or phi, or the Fibonacci sequence. Number plus the previous number equals the next number, and that number plus the previous number equals the next number. You just keep doing, and it gradually, right? And it's observable in nature, the way water goes down a drain, or a tornado, or a hurricane, or a galaxy, right? So it's this rate of expansion. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see if it applies to all these kingdoms? Right? And over the 6,000 years, and sure enough, you can see it does. And so you have Nimrod, Tower of Babel, and then you have Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, around 2500 BC. His big invention was to build a wall around the city, right? And after he does that, he wants to go on a long journey to meet an old guy who survived a global flood. Calls it a global flood. Matter of fact, there are over 150 ancient civilizations that have flood stories and flood legends in their ancient past. Gee, maybe there was a flood. Anyway, and then there's 2250 BC, Sargon of Akkadian. He conquers a bunch of walled cities from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And then you have 2,000 years of Chinese emperors. Of Egyptian pharaohs, 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, and then 5,000 years of Chinese emperors. And then around 700 BC, Assyria is the biggest empire in the world. And they have Sennacherib, Tilgath-Pileser. We know them because they took the 10 northern tribes of Israel captive, right? Nineveh was their capital. Jonah went to Nineveh. But then Assyria was conquered by Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and it was conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And then Cyrus of Persia had the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. And then Persia was conquered by Alexander the Great. And he had the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. And he stopped from going into India by the Nanda Empire and then Chandragupta. And the Gupta Empire is the biggest empire, quarter of the world's population there in India. And then around 25 BC, Augustus Caesar has the biggest empire. Matter of fact, he wanted to have a global tracking system, an NSA, right? He wanted to track everybody that's under his thumb. So it's called the census, the first global census. And he wanted, right? But God's plan is behind their plan. And so that caused Mary and Joseph to have to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem to be counted. But dictators want to control people under their thumb. And then 400 AD, Attila the Hun has the biggest empire. He has an army of 500,000 people. And they just scourge like locusts across Europe, just wiping out cities. The Christians thought he was the Antichrist at the time. Certainly had the spirit of it. Anyway, and then you have the Byzantine Empire with Justinian, and they're like the biggest one. And then Islam. Beginning in 622 AD, the Muslims conquer from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. They invade Spain, held it for 700 years. They carry away over 1 million Europeans into slavery. There were whole Catholic orders in Europe through the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians, and the head of the order was called the ransomer. And they would collect alms and donations to ransom your friend back. And anyway, the Muslims were stopped from going into France by Charles Martel. And his grandson was Charlemagne, and he had this big, huge empire that controlled all of Europe. And then in the 1200s, you have Genghis Khan. He conquers from Korea to Hungary, kills 30 million people, but he has the largest contiguous, that means land-connected, empire that planet Earth had ever seen. And then his grandson is Kublai Khan that runs China, and then Tamerlane, another Muslim leader, kills 17 million, wipes out Christianity in Central Europe. And then Ivan the Terrible of Russia. He kills 60,000 in Novgorod. But Russia has 12 time zones. It's enormous. And then you cross the ocean, and in the 1400s, there's Montezuma, and he has the Aztec Empire. And he is the intermediary between the heavens and the people, right? And then Atahualpa in Inca, Peru. And he claims to be a delegate of the sun god. And every single person in Peru was an employee of the state. And then the 1500s, the King of Spain had the largest empire that planet Earth had ever seen to this point. The sun never set on the Spanish Empire. He's taken the gold from the New World to fit out his navy to fight the Muslims from taking over Europe. And the Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. In the 1600s, the King of France has the largest empire, Louis XIV, the Sun King. And in the 17 and 1800s, the King of England had the largest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. 13 million square miles, 500 million people. All of India, a quarter of the world's population right there, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, and America. And America's founders decided they did not like this globalist king telling us what to do. So they flipped it and made the people the king. But I'm going to talk more about that. But there's still effort inside of fallen human nature to want to dominate the world. And we see communism and socialism are nothing more than dictatorships. You think, I thought socialism was everybody owns everything equally. Let's think a little deeper. Who decides who lives in the nice house and who lives in the dumpy house? Somebody in the government dictates those things. Well, whoever ultimately dictates those things is the dictator. So Hitler was the head of the National Socialist Workers' Party. Stalin was the head of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He was a dictator. And anyway, so this lust for global power goes all the way back to the fall in the garden and Cain killing Abel and selfishness being spliced into the human DNA. And St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And so the movie The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf tells Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. And it's like the pull of a magnet. It's like the law of gravity pulling a satellite back down to Earth. And so you put some babies in a playpen. One of them will take the rattle from the others. You put some kids on a playground. One of them is the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one of them is the diva. You put some natives in the woods. One of them is the Indian chief. And you put them in an inner city. One of them is the gang leader. And all a king is a glorified gang leader. Right? It's a hierarchical system. If you're friends with the king, you're more equal. If you're not friends with the king, you're less equal. If you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. And so it's this pyramid structure to society that keeps repeating itself all around the world. right? You got the Pharaoh at the top, the king, the dictator, the sultan, the czar, whatever his name is. And then you have the government officials carrying out his will. You got soldiers carrying it out with force. You got scribes keeping track of it all, right? And then at the bottom, you have the slaves. And let's say you got to be the king. Oh, that'd be pretty neat, right? Things are going along great. And then you have a sister that you really love, and she has a teenage son. And he starts drinking and partying and hanging around with the wrong kids, and he's driving his car, and he hits someone and kills them. And now this teenager is facing manslaughter charges, mandatory prison time, and your sister comes begging to you and says, you're not going to let my little Johnny get locked away half his life, are you? What are you going to say to your sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. Guess what? As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if you're family or friends with the king, you get special treatment. And if you're not family or friends, you don't get it. And if you're wanting to point out his favoritism and corruption, he's going to want to shut you up. And so it just happens. As power concentrates, it gets corrupted. And so these kings claimed to be divinely appointed. I go through it in my book, but you would have these Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be the son of the god Osiris. Chinese emperors claimed they were delegates or have a mandate from heaven. The Muslim caliphs claimed to be successors of the messenger of Allah. But then they Christianized it in Europe and called it the divine right of kings. God chose me to be the king, so whatever my will is must be God's will because he put me here. And so I can pretty well do anything I want. And if you challenge me, you're challenging God, and I can kill you. And so kings did not believe all men are created equal. They believed they were created a little extra special. And they didn't believe that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. They believed that they were given all the rights, and they dispense it to whoever they choose. And here's King Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. He's called the Sun King because his subjects revolved around him every day like planets. And he said, I am the state. One time, one of his administrators said, King, I'm sorry, you can't do this. It's illegal. He says, it is legal because I wish it. Oh, well, that's easy. The law is nothing more than the king's wishes. And he just happens to have a really powerful army to make you obey. Here is King James of England, right? Jamestown. And King James said, kings are God's lieutenants upon earth. Sit upon God's throne. The king is the overlord of the whole land, master over every person, having power over the life and death of everyone. And so you go through these 6,000 years, and you see that this fall in the garden, Cain killing Abel, one kid taking a rattle from another kid, the girl, the diva, it just keeps repeating itself. But with military advancements, it can get bigger. And gunpowder and phalanxes and, iron and so forth. And as it gets bigger, it ultimately has the goal of a one-world government, and that's left for the book of Revelation. And the evil manifests itself so completely that everyone says, righteous and true are your judgments, O Lord. And then it says, the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. And that's why when we believe in Jesus basically had the book of Revelation judgment pour out on his head. He took the judgment for every sin that everybody would ever do upon himself on the cross. And so when we approach God through the blood of Jesus, we've already been judged. I tell somebody it's sort of simple. I spoke one time out in Kansas, and it's real flat, and there's like cornfields, and the pastor says, you can see forever out here, but there's nothing to see. Literally everywhere you look, it's just cornfield. And the worst thing that can happen is a hailstorm. And you can stand in the field and get hailed upon, or you can run in the barn. The hail comes, but it hits the roof of the barn. You can hear it, ting, 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 ting. So Jesus is our barn. God is just. He has to judge every sin. And he's love in that he provided the lamb to take the judgment for the sin. And so when we're in Christ, Jesus took the judgment in our place. And the people that say, I don't need Jesus, it's like, dude, don't you understand? God is a just God. He has to judge every single sin that you've done. Otherwise, he's giving consent to it, right? The concept in law is silence equals consent. You know, the old wedding ceremonies, Anybody that does not in favor of this wedding, speak now or forever hold your peace. If you're holding your peace, you are giving consent to the wedding. So if there's sins going on and God doesn't judge him, he's giving consent to him. So he's not going to give consent to sin, so he is going to judge every sin. And you can say, I don't need Jesus. Like, dude, he's got to judge you. Or you can run in Christ. And the judgment comes, but Jesus took the judgment in our place. There's a whole lot more to that, but I'm going to move on to this, give my presentation on this topic. So, the King of England was a globalist. He controlled this huge empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, British, Honduras, countries in Africa from Egypt and Kenya down to South Africa and all of India and Guyana, all these countries. And America's founders decided they didn't like this globalist king. So it took centuries, millennium, for America's founders to get the chance to break away from this one world government globalist king. And James Wilson signed the Declaration. He says, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they should live. So he uses the number of 6,000, and he says something really, really unique happened right here. Daniel Webster said, miracles do not cluster. What has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. Why? Because if it falls, you're just going to have a globalist king. So we're going to jump into history and see how America came to pass. In my book and DVD, I go through the long story, but I'm just going to jump in here. So the Pilgrims, they're in England. The king had broken away from the Catholic Church, but then he decided that to really break away, he needs an English Bible. All right, the German princes had Luther's German Bible. That helped them to break away from Rome. His advisors say, you need an English Bible if you're going to break away from Rome. And so he says, great, get me one. He had William Tyndale killed a few years earlier for translating the Bible into English. And William Tyndale's last words were, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Anyway, so the king decides he wants this English Bible. But something unexpected happened. People began to read it and began to compare what's in the Bible to this king who divorced and beheaded his wives and so forth. And so a group starts that wants to purify the Church of England, and the king doesn't think he needs purifying. So he persecutes this group. Another group said, it's beyond hope of purifying, we're going to separate ourselves. And they would meet in secret and finally flee to Holland and flee to America. We call them the Pilgrims. So here's the Pilgrims. They fled from England to Holland, and then when Spain threatens to attack Holland, which they did, it was an 80-year war of independence for Holland to break away from Spain. So the Pilgrims decide to flee again to America, and they are going to go to Jamestown, which is a king-run colony, and they get caught in a storm. And 102 of them, 4-foot-high space, the between deck, for 66 days, 3,000-mile journey. Can you imagine that? It's not a cruise ship. And they're tossing and turning, and one young guy gets washed overboard, and they pull him back in. And they finally get to America, and they find out they're 500 miles off course. You think, oh, no big deal, just go down the coast. Well, it's wintertime and stormy and dangerous. And off the coast of Cape Cod is something where the there's the sand goes out. So you know how you can walk out on the beach and you can be out 100 yards and it only comes up to your knees? Well, out there, you could be almost a mile away from the shore. And there's a sandbar and you get stuck. And in a storm, you can't get free, and the waves will pummel your ship and break it into pieces. So over 3,000 ships, they call it an ocean graveyard, have wrecked along the shoals of Cape Cod. And so the Pilgrims almost wreck. The captain barely gets free of the sandbar and goes back to Plymouth Rock and says, everybody off the boat. It's too dangerous to do any more sailing. You're going to have to do your little settlement here. And the Pilgrims say, well, we have a question. Who is going to be in charge of us? There is no king-appointed person on the boat. The whole world is ruled by kings. The King of England is the most powerful king. And he has his navy and army, and he's got his administrators, and they run all the colonies. And you're telling us to get off. There's no king-appointed person among it. Who's going to be in charge of us? They do something unique. They give themselves the authority to start a government. and it is called the Mayflower Compact. And it says, we, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic to enact just and equal laws, as shall be thought most meet, unto which we promise all due submission. Simple, revolutionary. The whole world's ruled by kings and pharaohs and sultans and czars, and this is these pilgrims deciding they're going to rule themselves. It's a polarity change in world government. Instead of top down, it's bottom up. Do you see it? It's a little DNA change in the womb of this Mayflower. And it's the difference between a dead pyramid, where it's ruled from the top, to a living tree, where every root and every little capillary root sucks in nutrients to help keep the thing alive. Every citizen is needed to make this thing work. Everyone has to participate, right? So if there's a king, you just do what he says out of fear. But if the people are in charge, the people need to be educated. They need to know what's going on, right? It's a polarity change in the flow of government power. Instead of divine right of kings, it's we the people. And so where did the pilgrims get this idea that they could rule themselves without a king? From their pastor, John Robinson. He was not an Anglican king-appointed pastor. He was, this painting hangs in our U.S. Capitol Rotunda. He was a separatist pastor. And he's considered one of the founders of the Congregationalist Church. There's only 0.5% Congregationalists today, but back then it made an impact on the founders, and it was this model where just a small home group, 102 pilgrims, but everybody fasts and prays and votes. They simply took their congregational church model and they made it their community model. And so the pilgrims, do you see that? So the pilgrims come over 1620, and there's just a couple hundred of them, and they do a good job. And the Puritans decide to come over in 1630. They're over in England, and the king is arresting them and cutting off their ears. They have the star chamber, this room where they have stars on the ceiling, and they would do these interrogations, right? Sort of like an IRS audit, but you couldn't have any attorneys or no, witness. And they would brand you on the face as a heretic, or cut your nose in half, or put you in the stocks, and it was considered treason to not believe the way the king did. And so these Puritans decide to flee in 1630. It's called the Great Puritan Migration. 16,000 of them. So just a couple hundred pilgrims, but now 16,000 Puritans, and they fled into Massachusetts, and they're really happy to be here. But once they get here, they have a little change of heart. They said in England they didn't like the king telling them how to have church, but in America, since there's so many of them, they sort of are the government, and they think, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing that the government tell the church how to have church, because we're in charge of the government. And so they begin to institute Puritan religious uniformity. And then the Justice Black wrote in Engel versus Vital, when some of the very groups which had most strenuously opposed the established Church of England found themselves sufficiently in control of colonial governments, they passed laws making their own religion the official religion of their respective colonies. And so the non-conforming pastors had to flee again, right? So if you didn't believe the way the government did in England, right, you'd flee. Well, now these Puritans set up Puritan uniformity, and if you don't believe exactly the way the Puritans did, you flee again. And so these pastors, you have a Reverend John Lothrop. He and his church flee and found Barnstable, Massachusetts. Reverend Roger Williams and his church flee and found Providence, Rhode Island. Reverend John Wheelwright and his church flee and found Exeter, New Hampshire. And a Reverend Thomas Hooker and his church flee and found Hartford, Connecticut. And so this is a greenhouse on planet Earth. The whole world is ruled by Chinese emperors, Muslim sultans, Indian maharajas, African chieftains, Russian czars, King Kamehameha is in Hawaii, and kings of Spain, France, and Austria. And here you have this little greenhouse of New England where there's pastors and their churches founding communities and setting up the laws for their communities. And like Thomas Hooker, he lived in Massachusetts, and they said that only Puritans could vote in elections. And he said, no, anybody that's a Christian should be allowed to vote in elections. And so that was a big enough difference that he told his church members, next Saturday, meet in the parking lot with all your sheep and goats and cows and wagons, and we're leaving. And so they went through the woods, and this is 50 years before Europe's Age of Enlightenment. Oh, the Founding Fathers got all their ideas from the Age of Enlightenment. Okay, this is 50 years before that. These are separatist, non-conforming pastors fleeing Puritan uniformity. And so they flee, and they found a city called Hartford, Connecticut. And after they're there, the church members go to their pastor and say, "Pastor, how do we do the government thing?" And so he gives a sermon in 1638 titled, "The Foundation of Authority is Laid Firstly in the Free Consent of the People." Again, this is revolutionary at a time when the whole world is ruled by kings and dictators and sultans. Here he's saying, no, it's a polarity change. Instead of these dictators claiming that they're appointed by God and you got to do what they say or they kill you. No, it starts with the bottom up. It's the free consent of the people. This impacted not only the New England colonies, but eventually the Declaration of Independence, where it says government from the consent of the governed. His sermon goes on. The privilege of election belongs to the people. And this impacted our U.S. Constitution. We, the people, to form a more perfect union. His sermon goes on. They who have the power to appoint officers and magistrates, it is in their power also to set the bounds and limitations of the power. So his sermon is written down, and it's called The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It is the Constitution for Connecticut from 1639 up until 1818. Connecticut used Pastor Thomas Hooker's sermon as their constitution. John Fiske, a historian, said it's the first written constitution in history, became a blueprint for the other New England colonies, and that's why Connecticut is called the Constitution State. They have it on their license plate. And so here's a plaque in England. Thomas Hooker, founder of the state of Connecticut, father of American democracy. Really? This pastor that you never heard of? They think that he's the father of America. Here's another plaque in England. Thomas Hooker, Puritan clergyman, reputed father of American democracy. Here is a statue of Thomas Hooker holding a Bible, and it stands on the grounds of the capital of Connecticut in Hartford. At the base of the statue, it says, leading his people through the wilderness, he founded Hartford. On this site, he preached the sermon, which inspired the fundamental orders. It was the first written constitution that created a government. Here's another plaque in Hartford. Thomas Hooker preached his famous sermon, The Foundation of Authority is Laid in the Free Consent of the People. And then the people have the representatives pass the fundamental orders. And what do the fundamental orders say? The people conjoin ourselves to be as one public state or commonwealth. Doesn't that sound like the Mayflower Compact? We covenant ourselves together to form a civil body politic, to preserve the liberty and purity of our Lord Jesus, which we now profess. Here is another plaque in Hartford. They have lots of plaques there, and it says, Thomas Hooker's congregation established the form of government upon which the present Constitution of the United States is modeled. Do you catch that? His church government, where it's a bottom-up, the people voting, influenced Connecticut and the other New England colonies, and then it eventually influenced the U.S. Constitution, where it's we, the people, and it's right there. Thomas Hooker's congregation established a form of government upon which the present Constitution of the United States is modeled. Now, I don't have time to get into it, but in my book I do, the word congregation. So Muslims invade Greece, Greek scholars flee west, and it's called the Renaissance. And then the Greek scholars flee with their Greek New Testaments, and now the Western scholars translate the Bible not just to Latin, but all the way back to Greek, and they see different meanings. And one is the word ecclesia. And ek means out of, ecclesia means a calling, and it's a Greek word for means a calling out of the people, like in Athens, to the public place to deliberate and decide what's going to happen for their city. And so this is the word in the New Testament where Jesus says, upon this rock I'll build my ecclesia, an assembly of the people. And this is the same word that's referred to ancient Israel when they first come out of Egypt. It's a congregation, an assembly. And King James, the King James Bible is an absolute tremendous translation. It stood the test of time. It is the world's best-selling book, the King James Bible. You can, if they list the top 10 bestsellers, every week it would be the King James Bible. I mean, there's billions and billions of copies. That's because it's out of copyright, so anybody can print it. But nevertheless, there was just a couple instructions that King James gave to his translators, and one of them was he wanted the word ecclesia translated church. Now, that's the way that the Catholic Church had done for years, but the Protestants and the Reformers were translating that word ecclesia as congregation or assembly. So in the Geneva Bible, which is the one Shakespeare used, the ones the Pilgrims brought to America, the Geneva Bible, it didn't use the word church. It used the word congregation or assembly. William Tyndale's Bible used the word church as assembly or congregation. And he didn't like this. King James wanted the word ecclesia translated church. Why? Because he wanted to be the head of the church. Of Church of England. And how can you be the head of something that is a bottom-up form of government, where it's the people, the assembly, the body that deliberates and makes the decisions, right? Anyway. So, Reverend Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island and the First Baptist Church in America, said the government in this island is a popular government. That is to say, it is in the power of the body of free men orderly assembled. So in New England, instead of separation of church and state, it was the pastors and their churches that created the state. How could you say, pastor, don't get involved in politics, when it's Pastor Thomas Hooker's sermon, that's their constitution? How could you say church members don't get involved in politics when all there was in Hartford was the church members? The word politics is Greek. It comes from the word polis, which means city. Metropolis, Annapolis, Minneapolis. Polis means city, and politics is just the business of the city. And now, these New England pastors realized that the kingdom of God could never be forced from the top down. They fled from England, where kings were burning people at the stake and cutting off their noses if they didn't believe the way the king wanted them to. And they saw in the scriptures that Jesus never forced anybody to believe in him. Here he is, the Son of God. He said something difficult, almost intentionally, to shake away those that were following him for a free lunch. Remember that? And then it says that many disciples didn't understand it, and they said, this is a difficult saying, and they walked with him no more. And he didn't run after him with a sword and say, get back here or I'll chop your head off. No, he turns to Peter and says, you want to go too? And Peter says, you're the only one with the words of eternal life. But Jesus was willing to let him go and almost wanting to shake away those following him for the wrong reason. And so if Jesus himself never forced anyone to follow him, we can't. And so if the kingdom of God cannot be forced from the top down, how's it going to happen? Well, they thought that if the majority of the people held godly values and elected representatives with their values, then laws would be passed reflecting those values, and the values of the kingdom could come voluntarily from the bottom up, not forcibly from the top down. Do you see it? So this is the change that happened in New England. Instead of the European model from the creator to the king to the people, it's the creator gives the rights and power directly to each person. And we're all equal, and we choose from amongst ourselves who's going to represent us. And if they do a good job, we vote just to keep them in. If they don't do a good job, we kick them out and put in somebody else that reflects our values. And so we sort of conveniently leave out the king, right? And so the rights and powers are given to each individual. You see, the thing is, God is jealous, and he wants a personal relationship with each person. And whenever you get a king, he wants to insert himself between you and God. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar said, when I blow those trumpets, you bow to my statue. I don't care if you have a warm feeling in your heart for my statue. I don't care if you even understand what it is, my statue. You're just going to bow. Right? Sort of like a Sharia, you convert or we chop your head. You don't have to understand it or anything. You just, Allah doesn't care what's in your heart. Allah doesn't care if you have a broken heart. That's one of the verses in the Bible that's great for witnessing to Muslims, is that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to heal the brokenhearted. There's no concept in Islam that Allah wants to heal your broken heart. You just obey. But anyway, God is jealous. And whenever you have a king, he wants to insert himself between you and God and tell you, you have to believe the way we tell you. And there's a great quote from a Baptist leader named John Leland, and it's paraphrased, but he says, if the king can stand there on the day of judgment and answer for your conscience, fine. Believe whatever the king tells you to believe. But if the king's not going to be there on the day of judgment, you are accountable to God for your own conscience. Anyway, so Calvin Coolidge, president, says, placing every man on a plane where he acknowledged no superiors, he must inevitably choose his own rulers through a system of self-government. Okay, we're all equal. Who's going to fix the potholes in the road? Let's see, we got to elect somebody. Okay, well, who's going to fix the bridge? Who's going to take care of the kids? We got to vote among equals. And so this idea the Puritans got from ancient Israel, and it's the idea of a covenant where people are in agreement with each other, but they get their rights from God and they're accountable to God. And in the next century was the Age of Enlightenment, and it's people in agreement with each other, with or without God, and so they've changed the word covenant to social contract. The next century, it was an agreement with each other without God, and that turned into the Marxism and the French Revolution, and it makes the state God. And if you're benefiting the state, you're worth more. And if you're a drag on the state, you're worth less, and you're voted off the island, and you're killed. And so the state becomes God. But the Pilgrims had this idea that they're in agreement with each other in a covenant, rights from God, accountable to God. And Calvin Coolidge says, the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God, brotherhood of man, in order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action. Whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. And so, where did the pastors get the idea that the people could rule themselves without a king? A little from England and the Magna Carta, which came from the Code of Patrick originally, and where you limited the power of a king. Little from the Roman Republic, where they had 600 senators until Julius Caesar found a way to usurp power and make himself a dictator for life. They got some ideas from the Athenian democracy until Alexander the Great's dad found out that he could bribe citizens of Athens with money under the table. They'd betray their own city. But these New England pastors were very educated, and they originally got their idea of people ruling themselves without a king from ancient Israel. Think, really? Ancient Israel influenced the founders of America? Did you know the U.S. Constitution was written, but it needed to be ratified by 9 states before it could go into effect? They had 8. New Hampshire was in line to be the 9th, but it was having a deadlock, and the delegates were about to vote against it. So the governor declares a day of fasting. They get back together, and Harvard President Samuel Langdon gives them an address titled, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." Instead of the 12 tribes of Israel, we may substitute the 13 states of the American Union and see this application plainly. After his address, the New Hampshire delegates vote, and they ratify it, and they are the 9th state to do so, so our U.S. Constitution goes into effect. Our U.S. Constitution went into effect after the sermon, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." What was the Republic of the Israelites? Well, around 1400 BC, Israel comes out of Egypt, where the Pharaoh controlled everything. And they go into the Promised Land where the kings, King Og of Bashan, and all these different kings control everything. And Israel comes into the Promised Land, and for 400 years, Israel does not have a king. It is literally the first instance in world history of a nation with millions of people and no king. And so everyone was equal before the law. You mean everyone you see is equal to you? There's no royal family somewhere that everybody's buttered up next to? And if you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. No. And the law specifically says there is no respect of persons in judgment, rich or poor, all to be treated the same, male, female, made in the image of the Creator. Ancient Israel was the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. Everyone you see is equal to you? Wow, what a novel concept. Israel came up with the idea of tolerance. Here they were worshiping the one true God, and they never felt compelled to force the strangers amongst them to worship the one true God. All right, get your lamb, come to the temple. No. Israel was the first nation with private land ownership. Wherever there's a king, you never really own the land. It's always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross the king, he will take away the land and kill you. In Israel, the land was permanently titled to each family. If they got in a pinch and had to sell it every 50 years, the land automatically reverted back to that family. This prevented a dictator from gathering up all the land and putting the people back into slavery. if you own land, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. You got stuff, you worked hard, you saved it, right? And so it's the promised land because the people actually got title and ownership of the land. Israel was the first nation with no police. Everyone was taught the law. Everyone helped enforce the law. It was like everybody was deputized. We have a little of that today with traffic laws. Somebody's weaving in and out of the lanes. You'll honk your horn at them. Or maybe a mom watching a bunch of neighborhood kids. She has no problem correcting somebody else's kid. In ancient Israel, everybody corrected everybody else. It was a self-policing system. Israel had no standing army. You have a king, he has an army to enforce his will. In Israel, every man was in the militia with a sword upon their thigh, and they were ready at a moment's notice to defend their family and their community. Israel had no prisons. Remember in Egypt, Joseph was in prison for several years? In Israel, when a crime was committed, you got the accused and the elders together to the gates of the city, and you had the trial immediately. Of course, there was a city of refuge that you could run away to await a trial. Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. Remember in Egypt, people were selling their souls to the Pharaoh for a bag of grain? In Israel, when someone harvested their field, they left the gleanings, the corners, for the poor people to pick through, like Ruth. This way, the poor were taken care of and kept their dignity because they did something without some political leader collecting everything and doling it back out to those who can help him stay in power. Israel had a system of honesty. God hates unjust weights and measures. This became the basis for commerce. You could trust people that you do business with. And Israel got to choose their own leaders. You think they did? Yeah, Moses spake unto the children of Israel, how can I myself alone bear your burden? Take you wise men and understanding and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. So this was an election process within the tribe. Every little village got to elect their village elders, their town elders, their city elders. They were the ones when there was a crime that they would sit and they'd do the judgment. And then they would elect people to go to the tribal meetings, and then they would elect people to go to the Sanhedrin, the Hebrew Senate, right? 70 of the elders. It was a bottom-up form of government. Anyone could be raised up into leadership. Here's Gideon from a nobody family, becomes a leader. Here's Deborah. She's not related to royalty. She knows the law. She's honest. She sits under a tree, and her reputation spreads. People make their way all the way across the country to have her hear their case and tell them what the law says. Where else in the world could a woman become a national leader who's not related to anybody? Right? She's not related to a king. It's just her. And so Harvard President Samuel Langdon said, the Israelites may be considered as a pattern to the world in all ages of government on republican principles. From abject slavery, a mere mob, to a well-regulated nation under laws far superior to what any other nation could boast. Think of it. They went from 400 years of slavery, they couldn't even read, and suddenly they get downloaded the most unique form of government that planet Earth had ever seen. And anyway, Israel was the first nation that could read. And how am I doing time-wise? 5 minutes. And so the first invention ever was the plow. Cain was a tiller of the soil. And then people started hitting each other with it, and they turned into weapons. And then people gravitate together for protection. And somebody's a little bit better at fighting than the rest, and you say, you be our captain, and he helps you to survive. That's a good thing. But then he has kids and grandkids who claim to be an elite class, and it turns into kings. Kings want to count everything in town. And so in Sumeria, the kings, scribes invented writing with cuneiform, 1,500 cuneiform characters. Egypt, 3,000 hieroglyphs. Did you know only 1% of Egypt could read? Reading and writing was the scribe's secret knowledge. They kept the hieroglyphs complicated on purpose as job security. China had 10,000 characters just for court records, and only the upper class could read. It was the communication of the deep state amongst themselves. People were kept in dark. And anyway, so when Moses comes down the mountain, he does not just have the law. He has the law in 22 characters. So easy to learn. Kids could learn it. First letter is Aleph, second letter Beth. Sound familiar? And so Israel is the first instance in world history of a literate populace, right? It's a citizen-dependent model. And so the people are taught the law. So it's a total government on one side, king who rules through fear. No government on the other side would be anarchy. No government unless each person is taught the law. It's like everybody downloads a behavioral app for their iPhone. Instead of a GPS telling you where to turn, this app tells you how to act. Be nice to this person. Don't steal that. Don't yell at this person. And the Levites are the computer geeks that help you to download the app. Right? But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Israel had the key ingredient. There's a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal. Nobody's around. And then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience, right? And so the idea is that you take the power of a king, separate it into the hands of the people. You get rid of this God, you got a bunch of rules. Why follow them? Some will, some won't. Those that don't, it's going to turn into chaos, anarchy. Then they're going to say, we need someone to come in and restore order. Someone comes in promising to fix it. He takes away everybody's guns and rights and freedoms, and yeah, they'll restore order, but you're back to a king. And that's what happened with ancient Israel. And then they got King Saul. So anyway, I'm going to end with this. So we got these 6,000 years of world history. The selfishness that's in fallen man gets a chance to magnify itself until finally the King of England was the biggest, and America's founders decided they wanted to split away, and they make the people the king, and it'd be chaos unless each person is taught the law. And why do they follow it? The God of the Bible, who's watching everyone, wants you to be fair, going to hold you accountable. And there's more there, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Pastor Joe. Thank you so much.